Okay, so now we're going to start to make a basic bead shape, the donut. That's what I like to call it. So if you guys want to gather around, like a blue bead. So I'm going to grab one of my mandrels and I'm going to flame dry it. And you want to work high up in the flame, you don't want to work down here. That's going to turn your glass funky colors, and it's going to get it too hot. And you can hold the mandrel in your other hand if it feels more comfortable to you. You get really good at multitasking. So I'm just waving it back and forth through the flame, forward and back, and rotating it in my hand until it turns white, so that way I know that it's dry. And you want your bead release to be warmed up, otherwise your glass isn't going to stick to it. Glass wants to stick to warm things. So now, while keeping my mandrel and my bead release warm, I'm also going to introduce the glass to the flame. So I'm going to wave the glass through the flame like this from side to side. And a good way to know when your glass is warmed up enough to stay in the flame is if you peek over the rim of your glasses, you'll be able to see that above the flame it turns orange. And when that happens, it means your glass is warm enough to keep it in the flame. So now I've got some molten glass on the end of my rod, and that's called your gather. So you're going to build up a little bit of gather, and then this is the most important part to starting a bead, is the initial wrap of the glass around the mandrel, and that's called your footprint. So I'm going to just ever so gently touch my glass to the mandrel and rotate away from me. And I'm letting the glass just kind of fall on its own onto the mandrel. So right there, that's a footprint. Everybody see? See? Okay. So I'm just going to keep adding more and more glass the same way. And I don't work directly in the flame. The glass stays in the flame, but the bead stays just below it, so it doesn't warm up too much. Alright, so I'm going to make a tiny bead. I can always go back and add glass later if I want to make it bigger. And you can take away glass. So now I just want to shape this. I want it to make that donut shape. And that's naturally what a glass bead is going to want to be. So I like to hold it with two hands. I don't know, I feel like I get more stability that way. And it helps me keep my mandrel parallel to the workbench. And that's a really important part. If your mandrel's like this and you're trying to make a bead, it's not going to come out even. It's going to come out really lopsided, so you want it to be parallel. And you can see that the glass is starting to round out and create that shape.
Yeah.
And then it's just a matter of experimenting, learning what the glass does in the flame, to know how fast you should rotate. And it's all about gravity. So that's a pretty decent bead. And you can see how my bead's not moving up and down when I'm rotating it. It's kind of staying in the same place. That means that your hole is centered. That's a good thing. And And another trick that I like to do, just to clean up my edges a little bit, I like to heat up my glass until it's a little bit molten. And I'm also rotating fairly slowly. It's kind of hard to see. But let's say my edges weren't exactly clean. So while this is still molten, it's still orange, I like to tip it on its ends. And it just helps clean up your edges, gives you some nice edges. And there would be a perfect bead for Kim's project. It seems really simple. When you get on the torch and try it, it's going to be a little difficult, but that's why she wants you to start practicing now. Another way to make sure that your bead is perfectly round, you can look on the end. It's a circle. You don't want to keep it out of the flame too long. And what I just did is put it in fiber blanket. And that's the way I like to anneal my beads. You can buy an annealing kiln. It's great for bigger beads, but for smaller beads like this, fiber blanket works really well.
Crock pot, even still in here?
Is a crock pot over there?
No.
Nope. We used to use a crock pot filled with vermiculite. It's a slower way of annealing your beads. What you would do is you would turn on the crock pot before you start making beads, let it heat up, and then when you're done with your bead, you bring it over to the crock pot, stick it in the vermiculite, put the top back on it with the rod sticking out, and then cover that up in fiber blanket. And it would take about 3 hours or so to anneal your bead. We don't even do that anymore just because the fiber blanket works so well. Okay, so that's making a perfect basic donut shaped bead. Also, annealing, make sure that you've got 2 pieces of fiber blanket, one for the bottom, one for the top. And any more fiber blanket is just going to provide more insulation. So a minimum of 2 blankets. And you don't want to put your bead in while it's still glowing orange. You don't want to put it into the fiber blanket because it's going to squish it.
And it'll pick up fiber from the fiber blanket?
Yes, it'll pick up fiber from the fiber blanket. It'll be a mess. And you don't want to wait too long to put your bead in because it'll crack. It's going to cool off too fast. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some basic shaping. Let's get a mandrel. If you flame dry your mandrels too fast, like let's say I were to just hold this in the flame, the bead release would pop off. And if for any reason the bead release pops off during when you're making a bead, you might as well stop now, because if it touches that stainless steel, you're never going to get that bead off again. And normally it'll do that if you heat it up too fast, or if the bead release is too thick. Alright, I'll do a different color. Okay, I've got my gather. I hold my glass kind of like a pencil, and I keep it pretty vertical. So I'm just going to touch the bead or the glass to the bead release. Let it fall on its own. Rotate away from me. And if you start out with a really good, clean footprint, then it just makes for an easier time creating a perfect shape. Any questions so far? And for shaping a bead, starting out with a perfect basic bead shape helps in creating a perfect shape bead. But sometimes if your bead's not perfect, you can get away with shaping it and it'll look like it was perfect. So, I'll do a simple tab bead, and that's just squishing two edges.
Do you want to squish or do you want the marver pad?
I'm going to show them on the marver. Okay. Clean up my edges. Okay, so I got the perfect bead shape to start out with. And now I'm going to use the marver pad to squish two sides. So I'm going to heat up my bead again. Squish one side down. Squish the other side. So that's a tab bead, but I'm not done yet. You can see how there's these coils? That's from thermal shock, and that's what happens when you touch hot glass to a cool surface. It creates these like rings, kind of looks like a fingerprint in your glass. And to get rid of that, you're just going to fire polish it. So you're just going to kind of wave it back and forth through the flame. Careful not to heat it up too much, or otherwise it's going to mess up your shape. But just watch as those rings go away, and as soon as they're gone, then it's fire polish.
The marver pads on the torch are naturally more hotter because they're right next to the flame. If you use the marver paddle, it's going to be a lot cooler. You're going to get more thermal shock.
Alright, so I got rid of my thermal shock. And that's a basic tab bead. Let's say I want to make a cylindrical bead now, and I don't want my tab bead anymore. I'm just going to heat it back up, and it's going to start to form that shape again, the donut shape. Now I've got these tails on the end of my glass because when I use the marver pad to squish the bead down. I squish the bead's surface out and it's stuck to the mandrel, so now I have these tails. Doing that trick's only going to go so far with that. I'm going to have to add more glass to get rid of those tails. So you would add glass just the way that you're going to create a footprint. Making sure my bead stays hot while I'm focusing on the glass rod. Okay. And I try to rotate my mandrel at a pretty even rate, just so the glass melts at an even rate and one side isn't getting too hot compared to the other side. So it's forming the perfect bead shape again. Do my little end trick. So there, we got a perfect bead again. And now I'm going to make a cylindrical bead. The best approach to creating a cylindrical bead is to slowly form it. So it's going to take a couple goes. So I'm going to heat my glass up, use the marver pad, and start to roll my bead out. Bring it back into the flame. Heat it up. Roll it back out. I'll just continue to do this until I get the bead as long as I want it to be. But I'm not pressing too hard. A better way to make a cylindrical bead is actually to make two perfect beads side by side on the mandrel, and to then heat them up and kind of squish them together as you're rolling it out. That'll create really nice ends for a cylindrical bead.
And keep the flame in the center of the two beads. Glass will go towards the flame.
Yeah, glass always wants to go where the heat is. You also want to make sure that when making a cylindrical bead that you're keeping your mandrel parallel to the marver pad, otherwise one side is going to get more squished than the other, and it's not going to make a very even bead. Alright, but yeah, you can see how the ends aren't the best. And that's because I didn't do the 2 bead trick. I only did the 1 bead, so. You guys understand the basic principles of shaping? Mm-hmm. Pretty much anything you can imagine, you can shape it. And, okay. So now you can add some decorative elements to your beads to make them more interesting. I'll show you how to add dots. That's probably the most basic element out there to create different patterns. So I'll add some dark blue dots. So I'm going to introduce this to the flame. And you want the bead to be warm, but not molten when you're adding your dots. And it's pretty simple. You get a little bit of gather, touch it to the bead, pull away, cut it in the flame. And then you can use the flame to shape that dot of glass, and it'll automatically go into pretty much a perfect circle.
You also want to be aware of how large your footprint is when adding dots, because that if you have like a little tail on your footprint, it will pull it out. It won't go back into a circle.
I'm just going to go dot crazy and add a whole bunch of dots to this bead. Another thing is dot placement. I'm not thinking about where I put these dots, I'm just kind of placing them. If you want to create a pattern, you need to think about that before you go ahead and just start adding dots to your bead. You need to understand that the dots are going to get larger as they get heated in the flame. They're going to spread out. So now I've got all these dots all over the place. They're all kinds of different sizes. And there's a way that you can add more glass to a dot, say it's too small. Like this little dot's too small. So I want to add some more. So, heat up your glass rod, touch it to the dot, pull away. That'll add more glass to it. Let's say that one of my dots are too big, like this guy. I'm going to heat up the dot, have the glass rod cool, and touch the glass rod to the dot. Pull some glass away. And you can continue to do this. It's a little bit of a process. Okay? And when putting dots on, you want to make sure that you heat them enough so that they stick to the bead. Otherwise, if you just put a dot on, throw it under the annealing blanket, it will pop off later. It won't create a good enough seal. So I'm not putting the entire bead in the flame. I'm only putting the edge of it in the flame, and it's hitting those dots, making them turn into perfect circles. And if you want flat dots in your bead, if you just go ahead, put this in the flame and try to melt these dots down, it's going to stretch them out. They're not going to become circles, they're going to become ovals. And if that's what you're going for, that's fine. But if you want a perfect circle, you need to slowly melt it down. You can do this individually, one by one, or you can If you want them all to be flattened into your bead, you can just kind of stick the edge in the flame and rotate slowly. So I'm going to get this little guy to be a flat dot. And like listed before, you want to be aware that adding dots, if you're going to flatten them all out, it's going to increase the size of your bead pretty significantly. So just be aware of that. So I got my little flat dot guy in there, and then I got a bunch of raised dots. Okay? I'll show you guys how to rake, and that creates like a marbleized texture, and then I will show you guys how to make cane, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay?